For those of you I haven't yet had the pleasure meeting, my name's Melanie Stutzel, and I'm the Director of Health, Safety, Environment and Community Policy with the Minerals Council of Australia, which is our peak national mining association, and we represent about 85% of minerals production nationally. Now, over the course of the last 2 days, we've been talking about the fact that resource development can be a key economic driver for communities and regions. But to create the shared value to which we all inspire, it's clear that there's a need for government, civil society and companies to really collaborate around how you balance local economic participation through employment or business development with the need to ensure economic diversification so that we don't create communities that are solely dependent on mining or mono-economies. In our session this afternoon, the panel is going to explore the policies and practices that are critical to facilitating sustainable local, regional and national outcomes from resource development. In essence, we're going to explore how through employment, procurement and business development we can create an environment to support resource endowment rather than the resource curse. Our first speaker this afternoon is Mr. Jonathan Samuel. John is Head of Social Performance at Anglo American and has responsibility for the development and delivery of policies, strategies, training and guidance documents relating to the company's host communities. Under John's leadership, Anglo American's management of community issues has been cited as global leading practice. And John is regularly called upon to outline their leadership approach across a range of prestigious universities globally. Please join with me in welcoming John to the podium.
Okay, thanks very much, Melanie. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for the invitation to talk today. Just briefly, Anglo American's not one of the bigger companies in Australia and not present in many of the countries from delegates represented. So we principally operate in about 7 or 8 countries: Australia, Botswana, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Namibia, South Africa and Zimbabwe. So predominantly emerging markets. Our roots are very much in South Africa and Southern Africa, although as you can see, we've spread, and we operate about 50 mines worldwide. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we approach community development. You can tell from that list of countries, actually, by and large, they're all pretty stable places. They're all pretty democratic. They have their issues, all of them, but on the whole, a pretty good set of investment destinations. If I were talking about, say, an immediate post-conflict environment or something like that, our approach might be a little different, but bearing in mind we're sort of talking about pretty investable places that are very much in the sort of emerging markets mainstream or are already OECD developed economies. In terms of our obligations to support community development, we sort of recognise we have responsibilities in sort of three ways really. Firstly, to governments. Clearly we are given the permission to exploit a valuable natural resource, and governments only really allow us to do that to get some sort of developmental benefit, and that contract has become increasingly explicit in recent years. So before it was jobs and taxes and maybe some exports, etc. Now there's a much broader range of things that governments are wanting from us and increasingly codifying that. So we have a responsibility to governments. We obviously also have a responsibility to communities, because although many of the minerals we mine are sort of geographically abundant, for that particular community, it is probably a once-off chance to get us a major development boost. So there's a responsibility there. And then finally, we obviously have a responsibility to our investors. If we're not going to be able to meet the aspirations of the communities and the countries in which we operate, we're not really going to be allowed to continue to operate and to grow our business in a way that our investors would like us to. And I've seen sort of Professor Collier, who spoke yesterday, talk in London, where he says essentially, your main clients are not actually the people that buy your product. They're the governments that allow you to mine, and you need to understand what they want, just as any other business needs to understand what their clients want. And I think that's a helpful way of thinking about how we should be looking at these things. So, we're not a development agency. We don't have that expertise, but we do have certain things that allow us to make positive contributions. And we see ourselves very much as taking advantage of the money we spend and the skills and resources we already have as being the starting point for our planning of contributions to local communities and to host countries. So that starts with local procurement. Last year, Anglo American's turnover was just under $30 billion worldwide. About half of that goes out to our suppliers. So about $15 billion in procurement. 7.3 billion of that last year was spent in Africa. 4.8 billion was spent in South America. So you can immediately see those sums of money are actually quite large. They're substantially greater than the sums devoted by most bilateral donors to aid programs across those continents, for example. So they're very significant sums of money staying in the continents and in the countries where we're operating. Another way of looking at it is that our procurement budget is about 100 times our social investment budget as well. So again, you can see where we should be putting our focus. Just a 1% increase in procurement going to local communities has the effect of sort of doubling our social investment budget. So it's something we can really leverage. And because of that, we've put in quite a wide range of programs now to try and boost local procurement across the group. So that starts with changing terms and conditions, changing contract packages, changing payment terms, for example. We're also looking at things like supplier development programs, building the capacity of existing and potential suppliers. We're also looking at infrastructure issues like building industrial parks close to our mines so that the jobs that are in the supply chain can be attracted into our host communities. And quite often we find actually that our suppliers are very keen to participate in that, A, because it's helpful to be near us, but B, quite often where the mines are developed, there hasn't been a big industrial infrastructure that they can tap into. So in some senses, we're solving problems for them. We also need to recognize that they might only be our supplier for a short number of years, but to get a payback on something like an industrial estate, they might, you might need a 10, 20-year time frame. So we as a company purchasing those services and the host governments we work with, they can take that long-term time frame in a way that perhaps individual suppliers can't. And we're already starting to see quite significant results. We've really been working on local procurement for about 2 or 3 years. Last year, the figure went up from 9.5% of our procurement going into local communities in 2011 up to 11.3% in 2012. And that doesn't sound a lot in terms of percentage increase, but it actually put an extra $200 million or so into our local communities around our operations. So. And we've got 50 operations. You can start to do the maths. These are very substantial increments going into local communities. The next biggest tranche of our turnover actually is our employee costs, so labor costs, and that's almost $5 billion. And about $2.9 billion of that, for example, was in Africa. Overwhelmingly, our workforces are local. Most of the countries we operate in actually have quite mature mining industries, so it's actually relatively easy to recruit nationals. They might be expensive, but they are there. And so we have a wide range of initiatives to try and make sure we've got the maximum ability to recruit people from local areas. So that starts off with education programs, starting from early childhood development in some cases, through to school curricula, and then through to vocational training, and even university bursaries. So in South Africa, we're the biggest private sector provider of bursaries. In Brazil, we've built a number of technical training colleges in partnership with Senai, which is the Brazilian national vocational training organization. In fact, it's the biggest national vocational training organization in the world, I believe. So we've partnered with them to develop technical training facilities around new mining projects where there hasn't been an existing mining workforce. Another major focus for us is on government capacity development. Very often in the localities where we are, the municipalities themselves, even though the national governments actually compare pretty well on most governance indicators, the municipalities often are very weak, and that has major ramifications for us. Firstly, if they're not providing their basic public services, people tend to look to the people that might be able to solve that problem, and that's normally us if we're there. We don't particularly want to get into that business. Secondly, we pay a lot of tax at local level, at national level, and it's important that that tax is used effectively. And I think a lot of the debates around revenue transparency, very often people are assuming that money's being stolen. Actually, very often it's just being wasted. So we're very keen to ensure that those resources are used effectively. We also find that where local governments don't deliver on what it is they're supposed to deliver, so the basic services of education, roads, healthcare, etc., that's often a cause for social instability, and that's particularly harmful for an industry like ours that has immobile assets that really need to operate for decades before we get our proper payoff from them. And so in South Africa, we're working with the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which is a South African-owned but Southern African-wide development bank. We've got a lot of expertise. We've done similar things in Brazil with an NGO there called Agenda Publica. And again, we're trying to make this much more of a consistent part of how we operate around our mines to make sure that the local government is capacitated, can do its job, and actually, is seen as the accountable authority by local citizens. One thing that we've done in a relatively piecemeal fashion, but again, it's something we're looking to tap more into, is using the skills of our employees. So Anglo American employs about 150,000 people worldwide. Many of those have valuable managerial, professional, technical skills. And again, those are often skills that are lacking both at national and local government level in some of the countries where we're operating. So we're interested in thinking about how we can get some of that skills and expertise out into our local communities. And we've seen examples where simple things like the water treatment plant in the municipality isn't working, people are getting ill, or the water supply is not regular. We need all of those skills and have all of those skills on our minds. So can we do some sort of mentoring from our sort of technical specialists to specialists in local government, for example? We feel there's lots of potential there. Another focus area is enterprise development, small business development programs. We've been doing this in South Africa actually since the late 1980s. We have two big programs now, one in South Africa called Zimeli and one in Chile called Emeje. And between them, those two programs, plus some smaller contributions from newer programs in other countries, are now supporting about 65,000 jobs. And again, somebody yesterday said if every business just supported 2 smaller businesses in their locality, that would make a huge difference. Well, it does make a huge difference, and we're supporting about 2,000 businesses in the communities around us at the moment, in South Africa and Chile in particular. So, and actually companies are very well placed to run those kinds of programs, as well as having lots of technical and professional and managerial skills that we can bring to bear that perhaps don't exist in public sector agencies, for example. They have a different set of skills for a different set of needs. We also have very big supply chains, and we can help businesses understand how our supply chains operate and how they can compete effectively in those supply chains. We can also spot where businesses perhaps aren't doing as well as they might, and spot the kind of technical training, technical assistance that we can provide to help them sort of sustain themselves and become self-sustaining. And from our point of view, it's actually particularly attractive. If we're doing social investment, that's grant making, you don't get the money back. If you're doing enterprise development and you're doing it effectively, actually you get most of it back. There is a net cost. We're not trying to compete with banks to service businesses that could get access through the formal financial sector. We're deliberately targeting people who are not really bankable by the formal banking sector. So there's a cost to us, but it's actually a relatively modest cost for the benefits we get, both in terms of building our social license to operate, but also in terms of things like more robust and competitive local supply chains as well. And then finally, social investment is important. So Anglo American last year, we spent about $150 million on social investment, or another way of thinking of that is over the next decade, we'll be spending well over $1 billion on community development programs funded through social investment. So they're serious amounts of money. It's particularly effective where there isn't actually something we can use in our value chain to deliver. So things like education, health and welfare kind of schemes, there aren't really commercial models for delivering those that you can bring into most of the communities where we're operating. So there will always remain a place for social investment. But I think historically perhaps it was seen as the default option for community development. I think it's increasingly being put in the proper order of things, in the right sort of context, and perhaps should be the thing we use after we've tried all of the levers we have and the skills we have within our value chain and within our workforce. So I think with that I'll leave it there, Mel.
Thanks for that, John. I think it's really pleasing to see the approach that Anglo American's taking in terms of looking at how you can transform a finite natural resource into long-term socio-economic development. And I think one of the most salient points that you take from John's presentation, or certainly that I took from John's presentation, is the scale of difference between investment from a procurement perspective to corporate social responsibility investment, which interestingly has been where I think a lot of attention to date has been in terms of communities trying to partner with companies, and increasingly we're now seeing that shift to procurement and business development. And that's a lovely segue into our next speaker, Ainsley Butler. Ainsley is the Chief Investment Officer of Building Markets. It's a charity that builds markets, creates jobs, and seeks to sustain peace in developing countries by connecting local entrepreneurs to new business opportunities. Ainsley is also the Vice President of Anchor Chain, which is a social business that helps extractive companies to move from that corporate social responsibility paradigm to one which is really about creating shared value with communities. Since 2005, Ainslie has managed economic development programs across a range of countries, including Afghanistan, Myanmar, Timor-Leste, and Sierra Leone. And she's led teams that have built and brokered small to medium enterprises with contracts of up to $200 million. So please join with me in welcoming Ainslie to the podium.
The theme of this conference is maximizing benefits for communities. The development opportunity offered by mining is the increase in local procurement. Increasing local spending helps small and medium-sized enterprises create and sustain jobs, invest in their businesses, and establish performance records that make them more competitive and sustainable. Thank you to AusAid for the opportunity to be here today, and thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending the session and allowing me to speak to you about the work that my organization, Building Markets, and now our new social enterprise have been doing in economic development and employment creation. As believers in the transformational impact of entrepreneurship around the world, my colleagues and I try to never miss the opportunity to talk about the entrepreneurs that do business against all odds in the countries where we work. Poverty can only be beaten when people have jobs. And in the world's poorest economies, 9 out of 10 jobs are created by small business owners. The best way to grow a business is through access to opportunity and capital. Local procurement stands as a major opportunity. It's not new, but the focus on it is relatively new. And we've observed two emerging trends that help to explain this focus. Democratization in frontier markets creates the call for greater benefits from resources and the international presence. And greater demand for resources has companies and organizations going further afield than they have in the past. Typically, very little aid and investment that is spent on a country is spent in that country. And this is often due to the barriers that exist between the international community and the local private sector. Leveling the playing field for small businesses makes it possible for them to win, grow, and scale by gathering, aggregating, and disseminating information. We do this through our teams of talented local staff because local grassroots knowledge has a really big impact. Our work is implemented through 3 channels: connecting local entrepreneurs to international buyers, providing access to finance for SMEs through credit training and loan guarantee programs, and facilitating foreign direct investment by sharing local market data with private equity funds and other investors. Our model is called the Sustainable Marketplace Initiative, and it provides a suite of services that help to connect everybody in these markets. And the result is an increase in spending within the local economy. It addresses the problem of asymmetrical information that prevents more business from taking place. So our services include business mapping. So through on-site verification of small businesses, door to door, we collect a lot of information that allows procurement officers and investors to know what's available within the local marketplace and to leverage existing businesses to include them within their supply chains. We do tender distribution, where we aggregate all of the available opportunities in a market to small businesses who often don't have business development capabilities that their larger companies do. So they are able to access immediately all of the information that's available on opportunities and really start to understand in a much more sophisticated way the demand for goods and services in the local marketplace. We do business matchmaking, where we try to connect the needs of companies and international organizations with the goods and services that are available within the local marketplace. We do training, where we teach local businesses that procurement is the mechanism through which to do business with international organizations. And we work on access to finance so that the missing middle, the SMEs that are not large businesses and are not micro enterprises have access to commercial banking opportunities by providing loan guarantees. And perhaps more importantly, in the changing debate on aid and the role of extractive sectors in these markets, we do impact measurement. And so everything that we do is measured, and we understand the footprint and the local economic impact of spending in places where this information has not previously been available. And the data that's generated really helps to understand how jobs are created, how investments can be channeled in more productive ways, and how capacity of local businesses is growing. In the course of doing our work, we've established relationships with extractive companies. And because local spending is where the war on poverty can be won, mining companies may stop thinking about their CSR budget as their community development budget. Rather, we encourage mining companies to think of their procurement budget as their community development budget because of its impact. A small increase in local contracts can have an exponential impact on community development, and this has certainly been the case in the aid industry. Kinross Gold, for example, spends 0.2% of its budget on CSR, but over 50% of its revenue is spent on local procurement. A small increase in operational spending through local businesses can have a far greater impact than any CSR budget. It's in the increase in local procurement where companies can maximize local community benefits. Development is ultimately about generational transformation and genuine impact. Because of the long-term timelines that the extractive sector operates under, it's well placed to influence development. And because of this, we're not surprised that aid agencies like AusAid and CEDA have begun to work more cooperatively with the mining sector. To illustrate the importance of local spending, Canada, my country, spends $800 million a year on official development assistance. But there's over $30 billion in Canadian mining investments in Africa. And so this massive difference in ODA to Africa and investments is where there's really a strong possibility to change lives. How much of these billions are spent locally? We don't know, but we should definitely find out. Our own data, which is assured by KPMG, tells the story of impact on the scale of national economies in Liberia, in Timor, in Afghanistan, in Haiti, in Mozambique, in Myanmar. To date, we've helped local entrepreneurs win over $1 billion in contracts, which has helped them in turn create 65,000 jobs. We've distributed thousands of tenders, trained over 3,000 businesses, and mapped 16,000 businesses. Our goal is to double these numbers in the next 3 years. Thank you.
It's a bit scary being on a panel with some serious overachievers, but certainly I think that there's a great opportunity that you can hear around organisations working with extractive companies and with governments to really, broker the capacity building in communities and in organisations to line up the opportunity that's presented by procurement with the opportunity that exists in communities to take that up and create viable businesses that will be sustaining post-mining operations. And I think, there's a piece that Ainsley focused on, which really is, something that is emerging as the kind of key catalyst, and that is in the SME space, actually being able to help organisations to access finance and to partner for scale so that they can take up contracts which typically have been, larger than the capability of those organisations to participate. So bringing them together as a collective is proving to be a very successful approach to partnering for scale. Our next speaker is Mr. Hudson Mtega, who's a mining engineer and a minerals economist. Hudson has over 30 years of experience in the South African mining industry and over 10 years in public mining administration. including as the Chief Mining Engineer with the Malawi government. For the last 5 years, Hudson's worked in minerals policy, and Dr. Mantega is currently the Senior Lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand in the School of Mining Engineering. Please join with me in welcoming Hudson to the podium.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Being a mining engineer, I'll try and give it a little bit of a different spin from my colleagues, just to add value. And secondly, the fact that I'm the last person to speak at this conference this afternoon. When we talk about the mineral sector, we start with a mineral inventory. All countries have mineral resources and are rich in mineral resources, and we still spend a lot of money investing in generating new knowledge in putting up, in understanding and having our mineral resources base into reserves which can be mined. The next stage, which I think we should be doing, and I'm sure some of the others are doing, is really to analyze in detail the mine value chain of each commodity, so that we know the requirements at each stage to the final point. In other words, we'll then be able to determine what the requirements are and the shortfalls are, and what we need to do in terms of interventions for us to move where we are going. In that way, we'll be able to determine resources in terms of skills development, and you name it. That's point number one, and I think that's very critical. It is that kind of information that will provide the first basis of engagement with communities. In other words, they will need to know that kind of information. Now, I group that one in, say, Class A. And these are the big minerals. These are the major deposits that we've been talking about. And in terms of the inputs, these are the ones like what Paul was talking about yesterday, where you can then determine from the developing countries' point of view where they would like to go into partnership and at what terms with a foreign company. That's I would say in Class A, because you can use these mineral resources, as we were told yesterday, that you can use them in order to prioritize infrastructure, the major infrastructure, and of course, you can then link up with smaller opportunities in other sectors of the economy like agriculture, and funding the feeder input infrastructure, which can be funded through public sector or donor support. So if we classify that one as Class C, and this is what we've been talking about since yesterday and today. Then now going to Class A. Class A will be on the other side, which is artisanal and small scale, particularly artisanal and small scale miners. We discussed this briefly again. And this is the, I might say, the envelope towards the end where most governments do not pay much particular attention. Now, we require value analysis, value chain analysis for those deposits as well, in terms of the required inputs, and then determining the necessary support mechanisms in order to develop that sector. And in fact, the advantage is that you have various government departments participating at the lowest level in terms of several donor communities participating in various support mechanisms. And unfortunately, most governments do not do not give so much attention in terms of resources. Otherwise, I do not see that there is any magic around there. The reason that we are not paying particular attention, and this is one of the reasons why we say this is informal, this is illegal, is because of the disproportionate resources that we allocate in that direction. We are so preoccupied by the larger size. In other words, if we pay particular attention at that end, we should be able to create employment that links up with agriculture and all other sectors of the economy at the lower end. Then I'll come to the middle one. The middle one I'll classify as C, as C2, whatever. I think that's where there is the greatest opportunity for employment. And not only that, there is greatest opportunity for local participation in mineral resources development activities. Now, these are the smaller deposits, and some of them industrial deposits, and the minerals that are being extracted there are the ones, for instance, that go into construction. For instance, these are the ones that go in soil conditioning in agriculture, limestone and so on. These projects can be packaged. And these are low barrier projects. And we can generate, you can create what is called a junior mining fund, junior mining house, for instance. Now, so each project, so you have a fund, and that fund would have to have, you would then have criteria for lending individual projects, and you also have an exit strategy where you have these small projects having been developed and plow back the money and then let them move away. So you can now have a revolving fund running projects up to a certain point. These are the projects that have ability to create a fair amount of employment in communities, number one. Number two, these are the projects that would be able to provide seed companies among the locals, right? And these will slowly be growing depending upon what support, technical support that is provided. And of course, since you want them to run as business entities, and this is where we can now tap into a partnership with established mining companies to say, okay, this is the competence that we want. Can we work together in terms of managing these funds and in terms of managing these companies to run as business entities? So we can then use the competence that exists in mining companies to support the growth of small entrepreneurs in the local mining industry. And I think that will go a fair long way in creating local mining companies, albeit in a small way, but slowly they should be able to be growing up and in partnership with the big ones. And I think there is a lot of scope for supporting there. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Hudson. I mean, I think that concept of there being a real opportunity that's untapped around the artisanal and small-scale sector is one that people are trying to unpack. But certainly the opportunity that you've just talked about, which is around growing those smaller scale deposits in the quarrying and broader extractive industry and the industrial sector, and actually using larger world-class mines to leverage that change, is something that's certainly worth exploring. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative and ask a couple of questions before I throw to the floor, but certainly we've got quite a bit of time for discussion, so I think it's worth us taking the opportunity to unpack a number of issues that we've gone through today. But the first question I wanted to ask you all was, you've all talked about information, and you've talked about the critical need for people to be informed about opportunities, for people to be aware of technical and technological options that can actually help to catalyse change or to enable them to realise business opportunities. And importantly, you've talked about the asymmetry that exists in terms of this access to information, which, and still is seen in some quarters as that old paradigm of information as power. So I'm interested in exploring with you some of the structures or mechanisms that you've experienced that have been successful in helping to address that information asymmetry.
Go.
I mean, I think one of the biggest barriers is actually that local entrepreneurs don't know how to access and get information on the procurement opportunities. And sometimes even when we put them up, say, on websites or on notice boards, there's kind of a sense that there's a barrier there that they need to be invited in before they can, participate in the value chain. So I think there's something around being very proactive and actually going out and engaging. And I mean, because it's not difficult in some senses to make your procurement opportunities available. And it's obviously in our interest to make sure that, more companies are bidding for contracts, because that creates more liquid and sort of competitive markets. So there's a psychological thing there, which I think sitting from within a big company, you often don't understand at all. And you can't even really begin to grasp it. And many of the people who work for companies actually worked for suppliers. When I used to be a supplier to Anglo American in one form or another once upon a time. But so I think there are some basic issues about just having to make people comfortable about approaching us. I think there are ways about the way, how we package information and the requirements we have. So there's a tendency for contracts to be overly long and legal, and for us to have standard terms, which might be appropriate for certain categories of procurement, but certainly not for sort of small local businesses that are starting out. We get into issues around health and safety accreditations as well. So do we require ISO 9,000 or 14,000 or OSHAS 18,000 on our sites, and and what sort of vehicles do you allow on sites? There are all sorts of information requirements, things we don't necessarily understand are constraints for local suppliers, but also things that local suppliers don't necessarily recognise as opportunities. So I think that's a really important part of sort of informational constraints. And as I said in my talk as well, I think the one thing we do really understand is how our value chain works, and just the ability to explain that to entrepreneurs and to help them understand that actually there's no great rocket science to it. The tendering process is pretty straightforward, it's pretty standardised. Once you've been trained to do it, you can do it any number of times. So those are the things I think which are real information barriers for us. I think it sometimes ties into some of the enterprise development stuff which Ainsley was talking about. We also, as I mentioned, we run very big enterprise development programs as well, and again there's an outreach process that's required there to help people understand that even though they might not have a bank account or sort of a credit history, those are the kinds of people we're actually trying to reach. We're not trying to reach the people that can go into the local high street banks. The financial sector can do that. That's their job. But so again, trying to get out there and make it known that we want to be more approachable. And I think very often the important thing is for a lot of this stuff actually to rest within the supply chain, because actually, I lead the social performance function, Anglo American. We actually don't know much about procurement opportunities either, to be honest. We know the ones we commission, but we have very little sight. If I wanted to, I could pour through the data and our lists of tens of thousands of suppliers, but it wouldn't mean much to me. So the other thing is trying to make sure that the people focusing on these issues, both in supply chain and in sort of social performance and community development, understand what's going on internally and understand how we can influence and support each other.
So Ainsley, clearly your organisation saw a gap, which was around information and that sharing of information and brokering of partnerships. How do you find that works, and do you think that there is an addressing of that asymmetry occurring through organisations such as your own?
Well, there's a problem on both sides, on the supplier side and on the buyer side. On the buyer side, often organizations, procurement teams in places where we've worked have a quick rotation, aren't necessarily familiar with the local marketplace, and make a lot of assumptions that actually prevent business from taking place with local businesses. For example, in Afghanistan, we had a large buyer there that was importing water from Dubai when there was a local water plant just down the road. And because there's a a sort of security problem there, people weren't necessarily able to go into the local marketplace and to know that. But when we came to understand that they were importing several $1 million worth of water when they could have been bought locally, we provided information. We walked the businesses through the whole process to be accredited to sell water and to this type of buyer. In other cases, we've observed that the requester of a good or a service is not familiar with what's available in a local marketplace, and therefore design their request for a good or service in a way that prevents local businesses from supplying. So, for example, in a country that produces a lot of gravel, if the request is for 10 millimeter gravel, but locally they produce 5 millimeter gravel, and this doesn't make a difference in the quality of your final use of the gravel, well, there's a problem there. And so on the buyer side, it's really about educating them about what's available in the local marketplace and making reliable data available. On the supplier side, often, especially with small businesses and startup businesses, they're not necessarily familiar with contract-based business procedures, and so this is very intimidating. And so they're also not familiar, in many cases, with international standards and expectations. So what's on-time performance? Give your best price first. These types of principles we try to teach local businesses so that they are crystal clear on what this relationship should look like and what their commitment is and what also the buyer's commitment is.
And Hudson, you talked a bit about the National Geological Inventory as an information source. Now, the extent to which there's an opportunity there that's potentially missed by governments really to build local community information about where the geology that is likely to lead to some of those mid-class or world-class deposits sits, so that people can almost get some of those preconditions that will enable them to either participate more effectively in community engagement around exploration and minerals development, or subsequently to participate in the supply chain should a project proceed.
Exactly, and this is what I was trying to emphasize. To simply say that we have mineral A, B, C, D, and E is a necessary condition, but not sufficient. What you need is to go a step further. This is basic information, and it is available. How do we, this mineral that we have, what is required to move it to a usable form? What are the requirements at each stage? And you would even specify what are the benefits at each stage. It is that kind of information that you need so that for you to go and engage, you will be told what they want, but you must be from an informed position. And I think that's most critical. It's a basic starting information to have. In fact, it provides information for planning purposes in terms of all inputs that you need, training and that sort of thing. And if you're going to promote local investment in terms of investment in communities for those people that may be interested in, that's the information that you start providing. So I think, to me, it's much more important adding that kind of information to a mineral inventory that we have.
In the sort of 13 years that I've been in the minerals industry, I guess the biggest change I've seen is a clarification of the human rights agenda and a shift from it being very much the responsibility of sovereign governments to being the responsibility of business as well. And we've seen the work of John Ruggie around the recognise, remedy and respect framework. I'm interested in exploring a little bit about, are we creating a tension between local procurement and the ability of local organisations to capitalise on these, vast economic development opportunities that sit with the business, and these global standards that potentially local businesses will find it much harder to assure themselves to, and therefore, do we risk pushing companies into a space where it's better to be risk averse and ensure that you're meeting the kind of global expectations around, for example, not having any child labour in your supply chain, which might be something that is more standardised practice for some local communities. Do people perceive that tension's real? And if so, how do you balance those almost competing expectations?
Shall I go? I mean, we do audits of our supply chain. I mean, you probably can tell from the countries I described earlier that things like child labour are not massively prevalent certainly in the sort of the formal industrial sectors in those economies, nor is it massively prevalent in places where we're procuring from, whether that's Germany or Japan or China or so on. I mean, I think there's a broader point. We do find, what would be classed as violations of labour rights, though, when we do audits, and that's not necessarily just in small companies. That's sometimes in big companies, and that's things like withholding documents. It might be things like delayed pay and so on. And when we find those kind of things, the approach we take is to try and engage and to try and make sure that those sort of malpractices are corrected and ended. And we normally find, to be honest, that actually, whether it's because they hadn't realised they were doing something wrong or because they want to keep our business, we don't really know what's in their mind, but we normally find that actually people are quite willing to engage. And we've seen a lot of stuff, for example, health and safety actually is where we find most issues in the audits. And again, there's a lot of appetite from our suppliers to actually learn from the skills and the techniques and the tools that we have. The mining industry obviously has a huge focus on safety and it's got some very sophisticated systems. So the ability to share that, we're increasingly finding suppliers being very interested in our approaches to community engagement and community development as well. So we had a summit with some of our larger contractors in Southern Africa late last year where we asked them about whether or not they wanted to engage with us on things like enterprise development, employee housing, health systems, social investment, and actually they wanted to engage with us on all of them. So I actually think on the whole, there's a lot of appetite from local and sort of international suppliers. I guess the danger is the very small suppliers that haven't got the accreditations, and I think that's part of what you spoke to, Ainsley, is that you shouldn't be discounting a small business because it hasn't got OSHS 18000, which for those of you who don't know is sort of one of the standard safety management systems that we would expect contractors on our sites to have. So we need to be a bit clever about how we enforce that. But on the basic issues around human rights, clearly the whole point about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that they're universal, they're non-negotiable, and then your question is, will engagement help advance the implementation or will it not? And if it won't, then we would exit, but our experience is normally that people are happy to engage.
And Ainsley, is your performance monitoring that you referred to earlier, and is that with a view to sort of assisting organisations from a quality assurance perspective, the buyers, as much as it is building that capacity in the supply chain?
Yeah, we collect a lot of information that allows buyers to really understand the sort of level of development of the small businesses. And I think one of the things that's interesting from our perspective as a sort of neutral third-party organization that works sort of between these two worlds of suppliers and buyers is that we're able to organize for the suppliers meetings with buying organizations and for them to understand the various standards and expectations of different types of buyers. So for example, working with UN agencies, they have very similar systems, UNICEF, UNDP, UNHCR, for example. And then, working with mining companies, working with oil and gas companies, what are their expectations, what you should be looking for in your dealings with them. And so we're able to provide that kind of information.
Great. Are there any questions from the floor? Just here in front. Getting a microphone. Just down. Just here.
Hello, my name is Charles. I actually have 3 questions, each for each one of your questions. I'll start with the Anglo-America. I was wondering why you don't take advantage of economies of scale in terms of your vastness, and so therefore centralizing your procurement and that way, incurring a lot of savings. You spoke about financing. I was wondering whether there is any small-scale entrepreneur that have been able to access financing, that you have been able to help access financing to a level where they can be able to play effectively a bigger role within the supply chain. Or for example, they grow up into a major supplier. For you, Mtega, I was wondering, in South Africa and in the mining sector, there's a lot of happenings, strikes and everything. And I was also wondering what your take would be on what South Africans need to do to develop capacity for beneficiation, because part of the arguments that we have in South Africa is, or in Sub-Saharan Africa, is that there's no value addition. And so therefore all these minerals are shipped somewhere and they are sold back to us. So I was wondering whether just information is enough, or we need to develop capacity and access finances to be able to beneficiate our minerals. Thank you.
John, centralising procurement or to free up money for investment in CSR, or distributive procurement?
I mean, on the procurement side, we do both. There are some things where there are economies of scale, and those are typically very large items or very large volume contracts. But actually, and typically there aren't that many suppliers. So if you're thinking about haul trucks, for example, there aren't many companies that can make them. There aren't many companies that can make tyres for haul trucks. Fuel supply generally, there are a few big multinational oil companies, etc. So we certainly have a supply chain function that does do aggregated buying at the national level and the international level to try and secure economies of scale. There are 2 bits where that means that local procurement isn't in any way squeezed out. Firstly, is there are also diseconomies of scale. So you don't need to buy your stationary or your local bottled water supply from a central purchasing office in Johannesburg or London if you're Anglo-American. There are some things it's just more efficient to purchase locally. I remember visiting one of our mines in Queensland, and they'd worked out they were paying 3 times the local price for fence posts, and the reason was because they were being shipped in from a supply depot on the coast, whereas actually they were being essentially made locally and then sent to 300 kilometres to the coast and then being trucked 300 kilometres back once we'd ordered them. And we sort of found out there was a middleman there that wasn't quite necessary. So, you can get diseconomies of scale as well as economies of scale. And the second thing is that even when you've got these very big contracts, so we source many of our explosives from China, for example, for our mining operations. But actually there's a lot of local handling required for that. So, you'll tend to get the components brought in, and you don't buy ready-made explosives. People don't like moving explosives around ready to go off, in a sense. So the chemical ingredients are brought in on separate vehicles, they're kept separately, and you do the mixing and you do sort of those kind of things on site. So even when you've got those very big contracts, and it's the same with machinery, you'll buy the machinery, but actually probably most of the cost of machinery over its lifetime will be the sort of fuel costs and maintenance costs. So even when we're buying internationally, there will still be opportunities for local entrepreneurs. So that's one of the things we're trying to do. So if we've got, say, China sourcing on a product, we'll be trying to find local entrepreneurs that can provide the servicing or the final value add, so that there's actually a bit of an opportunity for economies of scale, but also for local procurement. You asked why is sort of the social investment side taking a back seat relative to local procurement. Probably worth saying, since I've joined the company, our social investment budget's pretty much doubled. So it's not as if we're paring back on that. It's just that, as I said, our procurement budget has consistently, for several years, been at least 100 times our social investment budget. And therefore, as I said, if you can get 1% more procurement going into local communities, as we did manage to do in the last year, that puts more money into local communities than doubling our social investment budget will. So it's the ability to leverage is one point. I guess there's also a sort of more philosophical point that it's probably better to provide developmental benefits to communities through procurement and through upskilling people than it is through grant making. Grant making does tend to create a bit of a culture of dependency, whereas if you're helping to develop and establish effective businesses, if they can't compete for business with you, they should be able to compete for business with other people if they're effective and if they're competitive. So it probably creates a much more sustainable, sort of less dependent local economy as well. So I think so it's really a shift in emphasis rather than stopping doing one to start doing the other.
And Ainsley, you work on access to finance.
So our work on access to finance has two components. One is a training component where we try to work with small businesses to help them to understand how to engage with a commercial bank. And on the other side of that, help commercial banks understand better the needs of small businesses so that they can adapt their products to those businesses. And on the other thing that we do is provide loan guarantees on the basis of contracts that are awarded to small businesses.
Right. You are talking in terms of beneficiation.
Both beneficiation and the labor issues and the wage issues in South Africa. How can you be able to dismantle one with the other so that peace can prevail?
Right.
No, I think the labor issues in South Africa, we've reached that. This is a critical component. I'd be happier if someone from industry dealt with that one. But I can deal with the issue of beneficiation. As I said earlier on, I think it is critical to appreciate the value chain of a commodity. How you process it from its rock right up to the end. What are the inputs in terms of energy, in terms of water, in terms of skills that are required, in terms of the quality of your product, and in terms of your market penetration. I think those are critical things to put together. And these are not the things that you can start overnight. These are the things that you should start studying them from a perspective of the owner of a resource. And then you start engaging stage by stage and see where you are capable and competent and engaging. So if it means you going into partnership with an end user elsewhere, then do it through your foreign mission or whatever it is. But there are so many ways. In other words, it must be looked on in totality. So much as we have so much cry about adding value, we should unpack and look at these components and see how we can deal with each one of them.
And you said the information is easily available.
And this is why I am saying per commodity, let's spend time to process the information and put together and make decisions. Information is available.
And
So you must study per commodity.
Yeah, but I still don't understand why beneficiation so therefore.
I think one comment.
Yeah, sure.
One comment on beneficiation. Professor Collier spoke on some particular issues yesterday. One of the things he's quite clear about is that if you haven't got a comparative advantage, say for example, in steel making or whatever, it's a misuse of those mineral resources to invest in that because you're creating a further dependency. And then actually you should be using your natural resource endowment to diversify your economy in different ways through providing broader infrastructure, education, etc. So, there are arguments in favour of beneficiation. South Africa actually has quite a good story to tell. It has a steel industry that's out of proportion to the size of its economy because it has iron ore resources. A third of the world's automotive catalysts are actually made in South Africa.
Yeah.
South Africa doesn't make a third of the world's cars or a third of the world's car components, nor is it a third of the world's car market. The reason why that's the case is because it has it's the major producer of platinum. So, and South Africa, gold is slightly different. You've refined gold and it ends up in a bank. There's not a lot of beneficiation there. And the other main mineral that South Africa has is coal. And actually thermal coal is essentially burnt. That's how you beneficiate coal, and 95% of South Africa's electricity comes from coal, so it's hard to see how they could add much more value. So, some of these countries, there's clearly an aspiration to do more, because many of the jobs in the downstream processing industries are relatively high wage, high skilled, and you can understand why governments want to aspire to that. But it's not necessarily the right thing for those countries to do, and investments in education and infrastructure may be a more sensible use of those mineral endowments and the rents from them.
Or indeed, our experience here in Australia has really been around the opportunity with the minerals equipment and technology sector, which is now, twice the size of Australia's wine industry. Which, it's really, we are the global leader in providing information and systems to, quite a large segment of the world. So, places like South Africa have an opportunity to capitalise on some fantastic local knowledge and commercialise that more effectively as well, I think, and add to that value-added opportunity.
I agree with that, but I think the core of my question is probably an assumption that there's more value to the end product in terms of price as opposed to the raw.
But it's
Margins.
It's not the
Yeah.
price, it's the return you
It's the
make
return,
on it.
yeah.
And certainly if you ask the mining companies, look at what they concentrate on, and it's the
Yes.
extraction of the resource, because that's actually where the economic return is greatest.
But we might take that conversation offline. Just conscious there's a question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Esbon Ade from the newest country in the world, Republic of South Sudan. We have a lot of minerals, but not a single mine as yet. We only have these artisanal mines for gold and so on. At the moment, there are a lot of companies trying to come to do exploration and then hopefully mining. Hopefully, when we come to mining, say in 3 to 5 years, I think we'll have the same problems which are occurring maybe in some African countries, in that companies are there certainly to double their money or just to create more wealth. So in the course of their work, they are a bit reluctant to spend on the community because, for example, in doing services like building schools or hospitals and so on, and even in training, they fear that if they spend, maybe their profits will be very low. At the moment that I'm speaking, we have 2 people in South Africa being trained. And then next July, we'll be sending 3 people here to Australia. Do you know for how long? In South Africa, 3 weeks. In Australia, 3 weeks. I think that is not a long period of training that can make one really competent in his work. So I will propose to the panel or to the speakers that they should devise a way of influencing the companies which are trying to train Africans to increase their budget for training so that actually the trainees at the end will be so competent that they'll be useful to their countries as well as the operating companies. Thank you very much.
Hudson, given your relationship with the university sector and having worked in public policy and government administration, maybe I'll pass that one to you.
Yeah, normally what you would do is you have a short-term solution and then a long-term solution. And unfortunately, where skills are concerned, you really have to handle what you might call xenophobic emotions. In other words, in the short term, you just must import skills. And then when you have imported those skills, you must attach a program of training and capacity building over a period of time. This unfortunately cannot be jumped. So you need, in the short term, you need to import the skills that you need. And then with a program through which you will have to build this capacity of training abroad and also on-the-job training using foreigners. The xenophobia will just blind you, but you need to do that, and over time it will be, that's a plausible way of doing things.
Gentlemen?
Thank you. I'm Pietro Toigo from the African Development Bank. This is really almost too good to be true, but obviously the challenges in bridging this asymmetric information are still pretty large. Otherwise, the growth in extractive that you saw in Africa would have turned in much bigger employment gains. I wonder if all three panelists, in fact, have any views on what governments, the host government can do in terms of regulatory frameworks or other type of schemes to really accelerate the opportunities for local supply chains to develop, and in particularly, what do you think about local content legislation, for example? And partly what multilateral institutions that advise those governments can do, like the one I represent. The other question is, given that we are talking about reporting and transparency, I wonder if there is a further possibility of building the incentives more broadly across the extractive sectors in some form of voluntary reporting about local procurement and what companies are particularly performing, if we take that as a performance criteria in terms of local procurement, and sort of create a virtuous circle of incentives. Thank you.
John, did you want to start that one off?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what can governments and multilaterals best do to support local procurement, I guess starting with the obvious things, it's all, we will be buying from local businesses, and, as very large businesses, actually, to a certain extent, we can sometimes be insulated from the local business climate, but the businesses that we'll be buying from are not. So, all the things that go into having an effective, supportive local business climate are very important, and they're more important for our suppliers in some senses than they are for us. So, good education system, application of the rule of law, well-regulated financial markets, property rights, etc. All the things that go into the good governance, good business climate indices, that people like the World Bank produce. So that's going to be really important for people who are our suppliers or could potentially be our suppliers. So that's important. In terms of local content, it's an interesting question because the oil and gas sector obviously has, extensive local content requirements very often. The mining sector tends not to. I think that's possibly partly because the nature of the procurement's quite different. So, by and large, as you're developing an oil well or a gas well, there's a lot of upfront capex, and then actually, in a sense, the stuff comes out of the ground. There are consumables and so on that are used, but it's a relatively small part of the project costs. With the mining industry, stay in business capex costs are actually a very, very high proportion of total life costs for a mine, and much of that is actually very specialized equipment, which is actually only really made in, by 3 or 4 manufacturers sometimes. So, is there something governments could do to boost local content? Probably. Could you be sure that that wouldn't actually be, in a sense, destroying profitability? In a sense, government might be getting something with one hand but losing it through in another way because profitability would be lower or investment would be affected. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about that. And then on targets, I mean, one of the interesting things about data on local procurement is actually it's very hard to do because, I mean, at the national level, you can measure what crosses a border. That's reasonably straightforward, although, it's even that's harder than you think because you can't really capture the foreign content in things that are made locally. So even, a car. I know UK car industry, about 30% of the value of cars made in the UK is actually overseas input. So we can't track that back ourselves. We don't have the systems or the capacity to look at the foreign content in things we buy locally. Some things are pretty obvious. If we're buying oil locally in a state that doesn't produce oil, then we know it's come from somewhere outside that country. But when you're getting into manufactured goods, particularly in some of the bigger, more sophisticated economies, like Brazil or South Africa or Chile, it would be very hard for us to measure. But we've tried, particularly at the very local level, we've got into all sorts of issues like what is local, and then how do you try and account for imported content and stuff like that. So, some voluntary reporting on, we are now reporting on our local content. We've reported on national content for some time. We're reporting on localized content around our mines now. If you really wanted that to be a strict basis for comparison across companies, you'd need to set some rules which probably would require an awful amount of work that probably wouldn't add a great deal to our understanding. But, it's worth a go and worth looking at, and we're probably getting something we're getting better at.
Yeah, I think the experiences that we have seen are that you take local procurement without emphasizing local content. You simply put the middleman source elsewhere, And I think there must be ways of unpacking, there must be ways of unpacking the inputs, whatever these inputs are. You must unpack them and find out what can be manufactured locally and what content. And if it be that the manufacturer of that nut or that bolt, let's try and localize a fraction of it. Otherwise, what it is that the local person, if it is a question of buying from a local company, that local company would like to maximize his returns by going outside and buy from the cheapest source, which may not probably be the right quality to the user. So unpack, and with the support of local industry promoters or Department of Industry or local local business community, I'm sure something can work together. Someone can work out. I know South Africa is going in that direction because we had quite a lot of fronting to meet that demand. But I think it has to be done.
Yeah, there's a lot of methodologies to measure economic impact, but understanding the footprint of an organization or a company within a local market is very important, because this is the basis to understand how more jobs can be created, which sectors could require more emphasis, what types of contracts create a higher economic value, those with more local production, those with less, the impact on the service industry. There are a lot of questions that can be answered. And also understanding the effect of this economic impact within the context of a national economy is very important. For example, to take the example of one project that we did with the United Nations was to measure the economic footprint of peacekeeping operations. Well, never in 50 years history of the United Nations had that been done before. And what we found was that even though very small percentages of those budgets were entering the local economy, 5 to 8% of the budgets, the impact was massive. And now today, the Security Council requires peacekeeping missions to focus on to know their local economic impact and to practice local procurement and other practices that are very influential in this early economic recovery. And so there's a lot of different examples from other industries that could be used for this.
Thanks. A question here in the front.
Hello. Andrea Shaw from Shaw Idea. I just wanted to reinforce, first of all, the issue about beneficiation in the Australian context. I think Australia doesn't have a steel industry virtually at all, and about probably likely to lose all our oil refining very shortly. But the great benefit we've had from our extractive industries has been in upstream and side stream development. And a lot of it has also been the the benefits out of the infrastructure that mining and other activities have delivered. So, for example, the wheat belt in WA grew from the water pipeline that had to be built for mining in Kalgoorlie. And we've seen that time and again. And I guess that this story is such a win-win for everyone. The benefit that building around the upstream and side stream efforts that mining and extractive industries needs. I wonder why donors haven't been more active in this area already. The need for better vocational skills that you need to supply to these large enterprises has benefits not just for mining but for every area of industry. The agricultural development and sustainable livelihoods that come when mining companies source their agricultural products locally. And I've seen directly the work that Building Markets has done in Liberia, which is and East Timor. It's just been outstanding. So why haven't donors been active in this area? And how do we help donors play a more constructive role, given the stuff-ups that governments can create when they intervene in industrial development and economic development? How do we get donors playing a constructive role to encourage what to me is the absolute no-brainer in this whole mining for development sphere, and yet it seems to be very badly neglected in my experience?
Anyone want to take that?
Well, I think things are changing from a donor perspective. 8 years ago when we started, it was a tough sell. I mean, nobody wanted to know anything about local procurement. It was not on the map. It was not something that aid organizations thought about at all. And things are changing. And I think part of that is data that's available now, and these new forms of impact measurement that are very difficult. It's very difficult to ignore some of this data. And so this conference and some of the new policies that are coming online in private sector development with a lot of the major donors like AusAid and CEDA and USAID and DFID. DFID says private sector development is in its DNA now. This is all recent, and in the last, this change has come about in the last few years. And so the good news is that it's changing. Why did it take so long? I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, it is changing. We have regular engagements now with donors, and there's an aperture. I think we're still getting to know each other, and I think why didn't it happen sooner? I suppose there are probably a few reasons for that. One is that actually, the development agenda as funded by the bilateral donors in particular wasn't a particularly private sector focused agenda, and so there's been a general opening up to private sector engagement, I think, and mining's been a part of that. I think probably 10 years ago, if they'd rang up Anglo American and asked who to speak to, they probably wouldn't really have known who to put them through to be honest. So we've developed our expertise and probably can actually have sensible conversations now in a way that we couldn't have done a few years ago. And I suppose donors, particularly because they all tend to be headed by ministers who are sensitive about reputational issues, they probably certainly the previous incarnation of DFID in the UK, the Overseas Development Administration, got very badly burned funding some very heavy infrastructure projects, things like dams and roads and railways, way back in the 80s and 90s, way before things like the IFC performance standards existed and where these kind of good practice guides were codified. And when you look at what was done, on some of those schemes, it was really appalling practice. They decided they were going to build. They got the bulldozer. They didn't quite move the people with the bulldozer, but everything else got moved with the bulldozer. And that caused a lot of reputational damage to those organisations. ODA never quite recovered from things like the Ilisu Dam, and there was a dam in Malaysia as well, Pergo Dam, I believe. So they were very nervous about those kind of big, heavy infrastructure projects, and mining definitely falls into that category for a very long time. It wasn't just us. They wouldn't go near dams for a long time. They actually moved away from things like major highways and railways for a long time. But I think maybe the maturation of the standards, the fact that we're engaging this much more, and the fact there has been a general sort of opening up to private sector, particularly as private investment flows into emerging markets have come to dwarf official development assistance. I think you're seeing that trend, and we're not there yet, and I'm sure there's much more we could do. But I guess debates like this and the conference we're having today are all part of that process. So.
In fact, anyway, that you've said something about still again. It's quite emotive in South Africa because we had a local manufacturing facility that was locally owned, and hence we were used to those prices. And then after 1994, you know, we privatized, right? Having privatized, it was bought by Mittal of India. Then prices went global. You produce, they produce, exported, and the prices were then internationalized, imported, and we pay the price, high prices, and all users have now to raise, you know, their budgets, and all that is passed on to consumers. So that's where now we talk in terms of local beneficiation. Maybe it would be able to, and we're going that way to try and probably do it differently. You know, whether that goes for all commodities, it depends. Whether we'd be able to have the economies of scale, we have yet to see what the results are. But it's something that should go, as I said, from commodity to commodity.
I guess just to add from a Minerals Council perspective to that issue,
Yeah.
I mean, our sense is that not enough time and effort has necessarily been put into understanding the various organisational drivers or sectoral drivers between the donor community and the industry. And in a lot of ways, you know, when there's a level of mistrust, we sort of revert to, you know, one group's a missionary, one group's a mercenary, kind of, to take it to its, you know, extreme. So I think there's actually, you know, we're at a point now where we need to have a much more mature conversation, and that is about, there is a shared objective. You know, we're in the same places, and it's about joining up the dots now, rather than kind of expecting that this is about, you know, companies wanting to shift their obligations onto governments, or governments potentially ending up in a situation where, you know, they're subsidising mining companies to have negative impacts on communities. So I think the time is right, and as John said, it's taken change, you know, within both stakeholder groups to reach a point, but if we don't change that culture now, I fear we might be having the same conversations in another decade. Are there any other questions? Wendy? Just down in the front, if someone's got... Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
It's on.
Thanks. I have a question for John. So Anglo has taken probably the most comprehensive approach of any company to applying a global approach to enterprise development at the local level. Would you share with us what your top 2 or 3 lessons were along the way that that can assist other companies in looking at developing a global approach that can apply at the local level? And I should have said, I'm Wendy Tyrrell. I'm from Orica, which is a mining services company.
I guess, firstly, don't try and compete with the banks if they're servicing a particular set of people. As I've said before, there's no value add in that sort of crowding out local banks from pursuing their legitimate business lines. So, you know, try and reach those who are disadvantaged in some ways, and that has different dimensions in different countries. In South Africa, it's about historical disadvantage and the legacies of apartheid very much. You know, in other countries, it's more simply done on an income basis, or, you know, or even targeting, you know, women, for example. So one, you know, don't be clear as why you're trying to do it, and that's really to promote sustainable local community development. I think the second thing is just to recognise that we do have we have these very big value chains, and we know how they work, and we know what you need to do to be successful, because we choose between companies that are successful and unsuccessful all the time. So that gives us an informational advantage that public sector small business development programs won't have. I think it's also important to recognise you need to provide quite a wide range of assistance. So we provide financing, we will provide technical assistance as well. And different individuals and different businesses will do different mixes of those. You probably don't expect to get all your money back. You know, our recovery rate is in the 80 to 90% on most of our programs. It's good enough for us. If we were a commercial bank, it would be disastrous, but, you know, we're not doing it to make money. And I guess the final thing, we started doing it when, certainly in South Africa, nobody else was doing anything like that. Technoserve had already been founded and was doing things like that. But the more recent programs we've established, we've done in partnership with NGOs, and actually in particular with Technoserve most recently. So there's expertise, your organisation, Ainsley, as well. There is expertise out there. The program we still run in-house in South Africa is Zamali, and we've got literally dozens of people working on that. And so that's quite a hard ask. We can sustain that in South Africa because it's by far our biggest operating country. We have a model that works, the recovery rates are quite high, etc. But for a business starting out, I would strongly recommend that you partner with the development NGOs who are increasingly active and increasingly effective in this space, and also talk to the donor agencies. We've had lots of bilateral and multilateral donors coming to us now wanting to put money into our enterprise development programs because they have money for these activities. Like us, they don't expect to make money from them, but what they lack is delivery channels. So we've just taken on 250 million rand, so about $25 million of grant funding from Development Bank of Southern Africa to double our enterprise development program in South Africa because the government wants to do it and knows we've got a model that essentially they can trust and they can audit as well. So, so those would be the key things I would suggest.
That's a lovely note to finish on, talking about the opportunities rather than the limitations. So if you could just join with me, please, in thanking Hudson, Ainsley and John for their presentation.